YouTube video series, video 3 of 3. Grow out aquaculture net and cage location factors. Panulirus ornatus are often found in areas along the mouth of rivers where the waters can become brackish due to freshwater runoff, but they are generally further out from the shoreline at depth. Brackish waters tend to have a brown tint due to the mixing of seawater and freshwater runoff. The freshwater runoff carries heavy particulates and stirred mud and silt along the coastal shorelines and mouths of rivers and streams. The Panulirus ornatus can adapt to more brackish seawater than most lobster species, which is why they are ideal species to be raised under lobster huts, which are common in the Philippines. It is common to find them being raised by growers in cages and nets within the mangroves or in the shallows along shorelines. In Vietnam, they are also raised in their nets and cages along coastal areas, but they are also being raised in brackish shallow shrimp ponds. The Panulirus ornatus species can survive in the lowering water salinity caused by freshwater runoff, but it is important to note that growers also often experience higher mortality rates in muddy, brackish water conditions. This higher mortality rate is due primarily to two factors. One, because brackish water during heavy and prolonged seasonal rains are subject to quick erratic swings in both pH levels and water salinity levels, which can cause unwanted excessive stress levels to be imposed on your seed crop. Heavy brackish water conditions can also greatly impair the ability of young developing Pueruli and early stage juveniles to properly intake sufficient dissolved oxygen levels, and can also cause unwanted stress factors which can greatly affect their natural immune system. 2. The heavy or continuous long-term rainwater runoff also stirs the mud along the coastlines, increasing levels of heavy particulates and silts. These heavy particulates and heavy silts far too often work their way deep into the cracks and crevices between the individual plates of their exoskeleton. This often causes irritations, lesions, and open sores to the fleshy tissue between the individual platelets of their exoskeleton. These lesions and open sores, when healing, can also fuse the flesh to the edge of the exoskeleton, which can actually impede the ability to successfully molt. The fused flesh causes an inability to successfully free themselves of their older exoskeleton during their molting cycle. This can lead to mortality due to a condition referred to as molt death syndrome, MDS. Also, this inability to properly shed this older exoskeleton during the instar molt makes the lobsters far more susceptible to possible injury from aggressive lobsters or susceptible to acts of cannibalism. Open sores and wounds also cause unnecessary stress, which taxes their natural immunity systems, causing unnecessary stress, which makes individuals more susceptible to infections and diseases. Often these ill effects are not noticeable due to their hardened exoskeleton covering, and these afflictions do not show until after they sicken or after mortality. This is why it's important to consider the location of your grow-out nets and enclosures to minimize possible negative effects and mortality caused by heavy long-term rainy conditions. These environmental stresses can quickly weaken the natural immune system, especially for young Pueruli and early-stage juvenile. Note, it is always advisable to choose locations which have a continuous saltwater current. This continuous saltwater current flow helps to more quickly remove excessive brackish water conditions and also assists in maintaining sufficient dissolved oxygen levels. This is particularly important when grow-out nets and enclosures are stocked at higher stock densities. For any grow-out operation, no matter how large or small, I cannot stress the importance of a steady current flow and clean, unpolluted salt water free of contaminants and heavy particulates. This ensures the gills of the individual lobster remain clean and clear, allowing them to properly intake dissolved oxygen. The higher your stock density within your nets and cages increases the need for higher oxygen levels being available inside the confines of the enclosure, especially when stocked at high density levels or the saltwater becomes excessively brackish. Long-term insufficient oxygen levels being provided within a grow-out net or cage can cause undue environmental stress, making your stock more susceptible to infections or infestations of virus breakouts or diseases. Excessively low oxygen levels can cause brain hypoxia and asphyxia mortalities. This threat is compounded if your location has poor to little water flow, which is insufficient to quickly remove heavy brackish water from rain runoff along coastal areas of converted fish ponds being used to raise lobster stock. Another factor which needs to be considered, especially if located in more shallow water levels, saltwater naturally retains lower dissolved oxygen levels than does freshwater. As the temperature of salt water increases, the level of dissolved oxygen diminishes. So as the water temperatures increase, the level of dissolved oxygen retained within the enclosure actually decreases. This can quickly become a crisis for individuals stocked at high densities. This is why it is advisable to provide adequate shade over the top and sides of your nets and cages, especially in shallow water locations. Providing sufficient shade helps to keep water temperatures within your nets lower, allowing more dissolved oxygen to be retained within the grow-out nets and enclosures. It is best to provide a shade level of 70% or above is preferred. Nursery shade cloths are ideal as they are long-lasting and are woven lightweight mesh materials and designed to last 10 to 12 years under normal usage. Shade cloths are porous, which allows both air and water to easily pass through the material, unlike tarpaulin or canvas. Adding sufficient shade and adequate shelter helps to provide a low-stress environment for your crop, which helps to maintain their natural immune systems. There is a point where one has to consider just how many lobsters can be held within a net or cage and still maintain the general well-being of your crop, even under optimum conditions. There is a maximum threshold where you then must provide additional aeration sources if you wish to increase and maintain higher stock densities. This will also be dependent on the developmental size of the lobsters, which are being held inside your nets and cage enclosures. If your location does not have an adequate water current and proper water depths needed to properly maintain the minimum dissolved oxygen levels sufficient to properly aerate a higher stock density, then you can expect to have higher than normal injury and mortality levels of contained stock. Three primary types of grow-out aquaculture setups. Here in the Caraga region of the Philippines, there are generally three primary types of lobster grow-out aquaculture setups. This first type of commercial aquacultural grow-out setup is actually the most common style used by small-scale lobster farmers here in the Philippines. These operations, though widely varied as to their size and configuration, still share a primary commonality with each other. They are common in that these operations are specifically designed to house Pueruli, planktonic, clear phase, H phase, pigment phase, or early developed agile juvenile seed stock. Once growers purchase Pueruli and agile juvenile seed stock, these individuals are placed in their grow-out nets, enclosures, or cages. Their intentions are almost always to raise the seed stock to reach a market weight of 1/2 kilogram, 500 gram, subadult individual size. The second primary type of commercial aquaculture grow-out setup is practiced by many of the larger operations. These operations still purchase Pueruli and agile size seed stock to raise to the first market weight of 1/2 kilogram, 500 gram, subadult size individuals. But these larger setups also employ additional grow-out nets and cages. This primary difference allows the growers far more diversity and configurations. They can then raise lobsters of different size and developmental stages all at the same time. This diversity means that they can also further house a percentage of their 1/2 kilogram, 500-gram subadult stock, so they can be further housed until they reach the second market buyer's weight of 1 kilogram, 1,000-gram adult-sized individuals. Or even further house 1 kilogram, 1,000-gram adult-sized individuals until they reach the third market weight of 1.5 kilograms, 1,500-gram mature adult-sized individuals. This allows growers to house second and third sized individuals until lobster fishing off-seasons and the Chinese New Year season, when lobsters can yield the premium sales price for their individual prices in the Asian markets. The third primary type of aquacultural setup are designed and configured to be quick turnover style growers. These operations focus on short-term rearing of seed stock to exclusively sell to other lobster grow-out operators. These quick turnover operations fall primarily into two rather distinct categories. A. Quick turnover growers who operate nursery grow-out nets, enclosures, and cages, who collect or purchase clear Pueruli and or latent Pueruli and raise them to early stage agile juvenile size individuals. These individuals are then quickly sold to lobster growers for their own grow-out operations. B. Quick turnover growers who primarily focus on rearing of larger agile juveniles and or early stage post-juveniles in their grow-out nets, which they then sell to other lobster grow-out operations. This diversity within the individual Philippine aquacultural grow-out operations allows a certain flexibility and opportunity for large-scale and small-scale collectors and growers. It allows operators to tailor their grow-out aquaculture setups to fit their own personal needs and the needs of their local markets. This also allows more diverse business opportunities within the lobster grow-out aquacultural industry. Converted fish ponds and raceways. In Vietnam, the realization of the amazing adaptability of the Panulirus ornatus species to thrive in salt water at a minimum 1 meter depth, low tide marker, and having a slightly brackish water conditions, led Vietnam lobster growers to begin lobster grow-out aquaculture using converted shrimp ponds. One issue encountered with the use of converted saltwater shrimp and fish ponds occurs during heavy rains and long-term rain cycles. Water conditions can quickly become brackish, combined with excessive mud, silts, and heavy particulates caused by rain runoff. These factors can each have negative and adverse effects as to the water quality within the enclosure. Environmental stresses weaken their natural immune system, contributing factors which can cause shock and mortality. The quick introduction of freshwater runoff can cause quick erratic swings in water salinity levels and pH levels. Salt water, which becomes brackish, diminishes DO dissolved oxygen levels. The higher the ratio of fresh water to salt water becomes, the lower the saltwater DO dissolved oxygen content. The effect being an increased inability of early developing Pueruli and juveniles to properly intake dissolved oxygen. Results can be stress, shock, hypoxia, or mortality. Water quality in converted shrimp ponds and raceways can quickly become difficult to properly maintain optimum conditions. Water temperatures can quickly fluctuate to above 30 degrees centigrade or below 20 degrees centigrade, which are too extreme for the Panulirus ornatus, causing stress on the housed individuals. Water salinity levels can quickly fluctuate from above 35 parts per thousand or below 30 parts per thousand, which can cause environmental stress, lowering their natural immune system. drop in desired food intake, and cause unnecessarily high mortality rates to house stock. These salinity fluctuations generally occur during heavy rain cycles, which are common during the long rainy seasons, especially if there is not sufficient freshwater-saltwater exchange to prevent excessive brackish water conditions to build to harmful levels. Another issue with pond usage is the water tends to become stagnant if there is not a source of sufficient fresh saltwater flow. Aquatic specialists know that the lack of oxygen causes toxicity within the pond. A pond that is lacking adequate oxygen levels is referred to as anaerobic, and a pond with adequate oxygen levels is referred to as aerobic. The first indicator that a pond may be anaerobic is noticeable foul odors and a rise in ammonia levels. The use of 24/7 aeration using pumps and paddle devices can help increase the level of dissolved oxygen contained within the saltwater enclosure. Pumps and paddle devices are not only expensive and costly to use, but these are often found to still be an insufficient long-term solution without a sufficient regular introduction of clean, well-aerated salt water to the older salt water contained in the enclosure. It will almost be impossible to maintain a reasonable standard of water quality. Uneaten food portions cause spoilage, and body waste, feces, and urine from stock causes an unwanted environmental stress to house stock. These issues mentioned above is further compounded in ponds which are stocked to high densities. Improper water management can quickly break down water quality as a grow-out cycle continues, causing the water to become toxic due to lack of oxygen. Elevated ammonia levels, which actually further depletes DO, dissolved oxygen levels. An ever-increasing probability of a toxic algae bloom within the enclosure. Nitrate ultimately comes from ammonia produced by a number of biological processes. All animals, including lobster, produces ammonia as they break down proteins. The main source of ammonia in converted shrimp ponds is biological waste. Rotting food, spoilage, and decaying biological matter, dead fish, dead invertebrates, etc., produces ammonia. Bacteria can convert ammonia into less toxic nitrate and much less toxic nitrite. But in stagnant ponds, any detectable level of ammonia and nitrate is harmful, and very low detectable amounts of nitrites may not cause problems. There is a delicate balance between the environmental factors of sludge digestion, nitrogen cycling, and oxygen levels, which can quickly lead to outbreaks of disease. As oxygen levels decrease and the sludge levels within the pond water increases, there is also increases in bacterial populations within the pond. An unwanted toxic bacterial bloom outbreak can affect the general well-being of your housed lobster stock and can even cause mass mortality, sometimes within just a few days. A pond which is designed to allow the regular introduction source of clean, well-aerated seawater, while allowing a regular portion of housed seawater to drain out, is always best. This can be easily done by simply using a series of culverts with fine mesh panel coverings, which are set at the low tide sea level. This allows the daily flow introduction of clean seawater into the pond high tides and the daily drainage expulsion of housed saltwater low tides. This generally helps to provide sufficient dissolved oxygen DO levels, maintain optimum ammonia NH3, nitrite NO2, nitrate NO3, and phosphate PO4 levels. Wooden pole fixed net cage. Fixed net cages are made out of wood poles which are driven in place into the seabed. As a lobster hut grow-out operation grows, they need to expand their number of nets to increase their net space. The simplest and often cheapest solution is to simply add fixed net cages. There are basically two types of fixed net cages. There are those which use heavy wooden poles which will serve as stilts for a lobster hut. The poles support the hut frame and floor decking over the top of the new fixed net, allowing lobsters to be raised underneath the hut. The second type uses lighter wooden poles. The framework of these cages are more like fencing and only need to support the walls of the netting and support a very lightweight shade covering on top of the enclosure. They are usually smaller wooden stakes of 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter and shorter 4 by 5 meter in length. They still drive them deep into the seabed, but at distances of every 1 to 2 meters apart to create a square or rectangular shape enclosure. These can be attached directly to the side of their existing lobster hut or placed close to their facility where they can be easily supervised and maintained. These additional nets are typically 3 meters by 3 meters to 10 meters by 10 meters, but they can certainly be larger or smaller as the size and shapes varies. The netting is attached to the poles. The bottom of these nets are permanently anchored by digging trenches recessed into the seabed, and then the bottom of the netting is placed into the trenches and then backfilled with sand, cobble, and small stones. This firmly anchors the bottom of the nets while providing a solid natural seabed surface inside the net enclosures. The larger, more established operations will use a second type of growers setups, which generally have similar same types of stilted lobster hut platforms and wooden pole fixed nets. But these facilities merely use these stationary stilted net setups primarily only to house their Pueruli and early stage juveniles. The larger juveniles, subadults, and adults are moved to submersible cages, lightweight floating cages, floating net cage platforms, or heavier floating deep water cages. This is because these larger operations are in constant rotation of stock and sizes. This requires constantly raising new Pueruli stock, needed to constantly rotate, isolate, and size stock using various nets and cage sizes as stock develops or is sold. Acts of aggression, injury, and cannibalism is always an issue when raising lobster, so they need to be properly separated during molting cycles and grouped by size. This is not such an issue with smaller operations, as they tend to purchase a particular volume of Pueruli and raise them to market size, then start again with a new purchase of Pueruli. Larger operations often sell or buy lobsters at various sizes and are continually adding new Pueruli stock at much larger volumes, which requires more specialized net setups. These floating nets and cages vary in a multitude of different sizes, shapes, and designs. Most are designed to float on the water surface of protected inlets, mangroves, and areas with shallow depths, and are made from lightweight saltwater resistant woods, PVC pipe, or metal frames. These nets are lashed to and suspended from the frame, and generally have net bottoms. They most often use buoyant items or materials such as 55-gallon plastic drums, smaller plastic containers, jugs, styrofoam, etc. to float the frame above the water surface. Lobster huts. Lobster huts are the most common lobster grow-out operation, as nets and cages holding stock needs an attendant to feed, care, and also provide security for their investment. Lobster huts are ideal as they are well suitable for shallow water depths, mangroves, protected inlets, sheltered bays, or any location which is protected from large wave action. The nets of lobster huts are generally built directly under the floor decking of the lobster huts, and the growers visit, overnight stay, or permanently live in the huts. They have removable floor sections, which allows the growers to enter their nets for general maintenance, feeding, and sizing sorting of their stock. Most lobster huts cover a ground space from as little as 10 meters by 10 meters to more than 40 meters by 40 meters. They use salt-resistant wood and wooden stakes of 15 to 20 centimeters in diameter and 5 to 8 meters in length and drive them deep into the seafloor at a distance spacing of one stake at every 1 to 2 meters apart. These wooden stakes are spaced in rows, which to create an overall square or rectangular shape. These wooden poles are used as the base upon which to build the work deck, floor deck, and walls of the hut. Most often, the work decking is larger than the hut and floor decking. The lobster huts are very easy to later build additions or expand working decks as you add additional nets. The wooden poles are perfect to create strong, protective, small enclosures under the platform and floorings simply by attaching the netting to the poles. The bottom of the nets is permanently anchored by digging narrow trenches recessed into the seabed. One simply has to then place the bottom of the netting into the trenches and backfill the trenching with sand, cobble, and small stones. This firmly anchors the bottom of the nets while providing a solid natural seabed surface inside the net enclosures. These nets are to also be placed in locations which ensure there is a low tide minimum surface water depth of 1 meter and where there is a steady current flow. The location also needs to be far enough from the shoreline to help minimize heavy brackish or muddy water interactions during long heavy rain conditions. It should also be noted that the stronger the current flows through your nets, the higher the stock density you will be allowed to maintain. The greater the oxygen levels, which are readily available to the individual lobsters being housed in the nets, will help to ensure the general health of your stock. Lobster nets also provide excellent shade to your nets, only needing nursery shade cloth on the outer sides of your nets, which are affected by direct sunlight. Expansion of the lobster hut facility can be quite easy without having to expand wooden decking areas, as wooden poled fixed net cages can be added to the sides of the lobster hut. Floating grow-out net platform. Floating net platforms are much larger grow-out setups and are primarily used to raise high volumes of lobster. These facilities have multiple nets, which also allow these growers to raise multiple species of fish and crustaceans such as grouper, milkfish, shrimp, and crab at the same time. This allows the growers to generate multiple streams of revenue and also raise trash fish needed to feed their stock. These growers who have done their research will raise 2 or more compatible species in single nets. This practice is referred to as multi-cropping and allows grow-out aquaculture facilities to maximize production within individual nets using a minimum amount of platform deck spacing and minimum number of net space. These floating platforms generally have a large floating deck area, which is used as a working area and often have a storage shed or security shed. They use wooden or bamboo walkways and crosswalks, which allows growers accessibility to their nets. These floating nets and cages vary in a multitude of different sizes, shapes, and designs. Most platforms are designed to float on the water surface of protected inlets, mangroves, and areas with shallow depths, and are made of lightweight, saltwater-resistant woods, PVC pipe, or metal frames. Floating net platforms are generally located in areas of less than 6 meters water depth, such as protected inlets, coves, backsides of islands, lagoons, or other areas which are protected and do not experience heavy wave action. These platforms can be easily anchored to the seafloor using stakes which can be driven or screwed directly into the seabed, or using heavy stone or concrete weights as anchoring. The platforms use buoyant materials such as 55-gallon plastic drums, smaller plastic containers, water jugs, styrofoam, etc. to float the frame above the water surface. Here in the Philippines, it is most common that 55-gallon plastic drums are used for buoyancy, allowing the whole platform to float 1 to 1.5 feet to 2.5 feet above the water surface. Nets are lashed, suspended from the decking frame, and these individual nets generally have net bottoms rather than the sides of the nets fixed to the seafloor. These growers generally use an individual net size of 2 meter by 2 meter by 2 meter, which are commonly stocked with clear Pueruli at a stock density of 450 to 500 pieces per net, or an individual net size of 3 meter by 3 meter by 3 meter, which are commonly stocked with clear Pueruli at a stock density of 600 to 800 pieces. As the lobsters continue to grow and develop, stock densities are reduced as needed. These multi-net platforms make it much easier to monitor and feed their stock, and also make it much easier to maintenance stock by size and allowing the isolation of stock during instar molts. Submerged cages. Some growers will also use different variations of heavy metal frames, which are generally covered with wire mesh and are primarily designed to be completely submerged at depths and anchored directly on the seafloor. These metal cages are used to house lobsters as small as early stage clear Pueruli to as large as mature adult size and weights. These metal frames can greatly vary in size, thickness, and weights, but also most are constructed from either welded square iron or angle iron, which allows considerable strength. These welded metal frames are then covered using various size metal or wire mesh, which can have small fine hole diameters sufficient to house early stage clear Pueruli to much larger hole diameters of 10 to 16 millimeter used to house mature adult individuals. The bottom shape of the submerged cages can be octangular, rectangular, or square, and can greatly vary in size from as small as 1 meter by 1 meter or as large as 16 meter by 16 meters, with cage heights generally being less than 2 meters. Large submerged cages are generally towed to the location and lowered into place at depth using boat riggings and scuba divers directly to the seafloor. These cages have hinged or removable access hatches needed to allow the feeding, sizing, and maintenancing of housed stock. Access inside these cages is needed also so the cages can be properly cleaned and maintained. Note, when designing these types of cages, one must consider the importance of the daily removal of spoilage and regular cleaning and maintaining of the enclosure. Many smaller submerged cage designs used in shallow locations are fitted with metal feeding tubes, so pelletized or live feed can be poured or released into these pipes from the water surface. These feeds then enter the metal cages. Though costly to initially construct metal submersible cages, these provide a level of security that wooden net cages simply cannot provide. Net cages can be ripped, cut, or torn by floating debris or lobster thieves, as metal submersible cages are far stronger and can be placed at water depths unaffected by storms and beyond the reach of most lobster thieves. There are several reasons why small metal cages are ideal to use in shallow waters. A. They can be lowered and directly anchored to the seafloor. B. Metal cages are far more impervious to unwanted rips, cuts, and tears. C. They provide more protection from the average lobster thieves, as they are placed at lower depths than the wooden pole and netting cages, which are on or near the water surface. Round Deepwater net cage. Offshore cages are referred to as cultivation net cage systems, offshore cages, deep sea cages, or deep water cages. I personally like to use the term round deepwater net cage. These, used for lobster, are round, octangular, and rectangular shaped, and used generally for water depths of 6 meters to 30 meters. These net cage setups tend to be of lighter construction and used close to the shoreline compared to those used out in deep sea waters. These net cages have an advantage over the wooden floating grow-out platforms mentioned above. The net cage is far more durable in heavy unprotected locations, which have heavier wave action. Their round design and heavy pipe construction makes the net cage system far more anti-wind, anti-current, and anti-wave in heavier wave action. These cages are usually constructed of heavy pipe construction with metal girders to the outer edge of the frame. These metal girders are used to fix either a wooden or metal walkway all the way around the net cage frame. Often they have outer pipe safety hand railing around the outer circumference of the circular walkway surface. This is to help protect attendants from falling off or being washed off the walkways during heavy wave action or rough water conditions. Most net cage systems use 55-gallon plastic drums positioned and secured under the circular walkway. The netting is fixed and lashed to the outer circumference of the cage frame. Generally, these setups use a small 3-foot to 6-foot high fencing frame, which is attached around the inner circumference of the platform frame. This helps to prevent the loss of stock during large wave action. They usually have to have a top netting or nursery shade cloth, which is lashed to the top of the inner fencing pipe frame. These cultivation net cage systems come in a myriad of different configurations, shapes, and sizes. Some of the larger, more complex systems have heavy wire mesh outer sides or use multiple layers of netting to help protect the stock being housed inside the inner net from damage by floating debris or predators. The importance of shelters. When Panulirus ornatus are developing from the earliest agile juvenile to the late juvenile developmental stages, the Panulirus ornatus are extremely cannibalistic by nature. This makes them especially vulnerable to physical injury and mortality during their molting cycles and the following week after the molt, while their new exoskeleton has not fully hardened. It is for this reason lobsters need to be provided sufficient shelters during these developmental stages. Tests were conducted showing that juveniles actually eat more and gain weight faster when they are provided proper shelters and reduces mortality. This has also been shown that the use of net bundle shelters have the lowest mortality rates. Grow out net sizes. Pueruli, fine mesh size. Juveniles, fine mesh size less than 12 millimeter. Subadult, medium mesh size. Adults, larger mesh size less than 20 millimeters. High mortality rates during production causes. One major issue that faces a grow-out operation raising Panulirus ornatus pueruli to market size subadults and adults is high mortality rates. The two leading causes of the high mortality rate experienced by growers are molt death syndrome, MDS, and cannibalism. MDS is a general term used for mortality during the molting process, causing the inability to completely free itself from the old exoskeleton. Conditions such as poor, improper diet, environmental stresses, poor sanitation, insufficient water quality, and improper husbandry can all be contributing factors leading to molt death syndrome, MDS. Then there is the issue of cannibalism. When researching, it is constantly written that during the 3 to 4 month phase that the post-larval Panulirus ornatus puellulae, while progressing through their 4 puellarous developmental stages, are in a non-feeding phase of development. Well, the reality that is faced by those who actually raise puellulae is that these little non-feeding stage puellulae sure love eating each other. Now, I'm not challenging intellectual authority, nor am I stating that this non-feeding phase is a myth. But growers have long known that the 2 primary causes of puellulae mortality when housed together in a single enclosure is cannibalism and molt death syndrome, MDS. Puellulae may be non-feeding, but as I stated, they still seem to sure love eating each other as a nursery activity. Juveniles are also extremely cannibalistic and quite aggressive towards each other, and will cause severe bodily harm to the point of death. Sufficient sheltering and monitoring to help isolate both puellulae and for juveniles is essential during molting periods. It is also essential to provide constant monitoring of subadults and adult lobsters inside your enclosures, as they too have cannibalistic tendencies, which will help minimize mortality rates within your own grow-out operation. Another major cause of mortality to stock is using improper feeding ratios and feeding times, or providing a poor diet with insufficient proteins and/or nutrients. This is highly problematic as it is known to contribute to molt death syndrome, MDS. These factors can cause serious negative effects to the immune system of younger developing lobsters, making them more susceptible to infections, carapace lesions, and diseases. The inability to provide adequate nutrition during development can cause a metabolic dysfunction in their calcium metabolism, preventing the proper formation of their exoskeleton during instar molts. This can be further exacerbated by any carapace lesions incurred during their intermolt periods, which can be a hindrance to being able to successfully freeing themselves from their old exoskeleton or in the development of their newer exoskeleton. Overfeeding of proper nutritional value can cause excessive bloating during the intermolt periods, causing flesh to protrude between the seams of their exoskeleton, hindering their ability to completely free themselves during instar molt. This can also affect the level of pigmentation of their exoskeleton, which can lower their market price. Poor sanitation, insufficient water quality can be a major issue as it causes unnecessary stresses on the young developing lobster. Stress is known to lower their immune system, and environmental stresses such as insufficient aeration and erratic swings in pH levels, salinity levels, and water temperature lower their natural immune systems. Improper water management issues such as overly brackish water conditions, muds, silts, and heavy particulates can cause irritations to the fleshy seams of their exoskeleton, causing sores, abrasions, and lesions. And factors such as fouling food particles, excrement, and pollutants can cause infections or infestation. Improper handling and improper husbandry can cause high levels of stress, which lowers their natural immune system. Not providing sufficient sheltering, removing and isolating fresh molting lobsters, or properly sizing stock within the nets, cages, or enclosures can lead to bodily injury and mortality due to acts of aggression and cannibalism by other lobsters within their enclosures. The mortality rates commonly experienced by local grow-out operations of 2 centimeter size clear puellulae raised to agile juvenile is 50 to 60% mortality, primarily due to MDS and cannibalism. and the common mortality rate of agile juvenile to subadult can be as high as 50% to as low as 10% mortality, primarily due to poor husbandry, poor diet, MDS, and cannibalism. Vietnam growers have found that with proper husbandry and good nutrition, that grow-out survival should be consistently above 90%. Which means the more of these issues mentioned above that the grow-out operation works on solving equates to higher survival rates and the potential for higher profits. Marketable growth rates: 3 to 5 gram Pueruli to 500 gram half kilogram. Buyer's minimum market weight, average 8 to 12 months. 3 to 5 gram Pueruli to 1,000 gram 1 kilogram. Buyer's premium market weight, average 18 to 20 months. Optimum levels: temperature, minimum 27 centigrade, maximum 31 centigrade. Salinity, minimum 34 parts per thousand, maximum 35 parts per thousand. pH, minimum 7.8, maximum 8.5. Dissolved oxygen, greater than 4.5 milligrams per liter. Total ammonia, less than 1 part per million. Free ammonia, less than 0.25 parts per million. Nitrate, less than 0.25 parts per million. Salinity and effects: 20 parts per thousand. Lobsters can only develop when the salinity is above 20 parts per thousand. 34 to 35 parts per thousand, optimum levels. 35 parts per thousand, experience elevated ammonia levels, 0.25 parts per million, can cause mortality. 38 parts per thousand, maximum level. Fluctuations and lower water salinity slows growth and increases mortality rates. Survival mortality rates, Pueruli and juveniles. Survival rate: Pueruli stage to 2 centimeter length, agile juvenile 40% to 60%. Mortality rate: Pueruli stage to 2 centimeter length, agile juvenile 40% to 60%. Survival rate: agile juvenile to 500 gram subadult 90%. Mortality rate: agile juvenile to 500 gram subadult 10%. Water tolerances: temperature, maximum 31 Celsius, minimum 4.43 Celsius. Salinity, maximum 35 parts per thousand, minimum 25 parts per thousand. pH, maximum 8.3, minimum 7.0. Silicate concentration, maximum 119.75 micron mole per liter, minimum 1.06 micron mole per liter. Phosphate concentration, maximum 2.77 micron mole per liter, minimum 0.081 micron mole per liter. Dissolved oxygen DO levels, maximum 80%, minimum 70%. Dissolved O2 concentration, maximum 4.62 milliliters per liter, minimum 1.87 milliliter per liter. O2 saturation, maximum 99.89%, minimum 25.81%. Nitrate concentration, maximum 33.95 micromole per liter, minimum 0.53 micromole per liter. Total ammonia, less than 1 part per million. Free ammonia, less than 0.25 parts per million. Common measurements used: micron mole per liter, milliliter per liter, milligram per liter. Effects of inorganic nutrient levels. Ammonia, NH3, 0.0 milligram per liter to 8.0 milligram per liter. Note: ammonia levels above 10 milligrams per liter inhibit growth in crustaceans. Nitrite, NO2, less than 0.25 parts per million. Nitrate, NO3, 3 parts per million to 30 parts per million. Phosphate, PO4, less than 0.07 parts per million. Water depth, maximum 1,000 meter, minimum 1 meter. Generally found at depths 9 meters to 500 meters. Lifespan: males 35 years, females 50 years. Body length: common length 35 centimeter, maximum length 50 centimeters. Marketable weight: common market 500 gram subadult, common market 1,000 gram adult, common market 1,500 gram adult. Maximum total weight 7 kilogram to 9 kilogram. Temperature facts: 19 centigrade, almost no growth occurs and little to no molting. 24 centigrade, winter temperature. 25 centigrade to 31 centigrade, maximum food intake, growth, and survival rate. 26 centigrade to 29 centigrade, optimum conditions to rear Phyllisomata. 27 centigrade, molt increments greatest and intermolt periods least. 28 centigrade and below, experience highest mortality rates. 29 centigrade, summer temperatures. Note: important to avoid quick, erratic temperature fluctuations, increases mortality rate. Higher temperatures increases cannibalism. Temperatures may be an important cue to pre-reproduction molting. Eggs kept at lower incubation temperatures will take longer to hatch, but are believed to be a superior and hardier hatchling, helping to maintain loss. Eggs would be hatched over a longer period of days. When dealing with thousands of hatchlings in a small facility would allow better time management and aid in food preparation times. This would greatly help to decrease mortality rates within a brood. Salinity facts: 38 parts per thousand, maximum level. 35 parts per thousand, full marine salinity level. 35 parts per thousand, experiences elevated ammonia levels which lower pH levels. 35 parts per thousand, highest growth rates. 35 parts per thousand, highest acts of cannibalism. Erratic fluctuations in salinity levels slows growth and increases mortality in all stages of development. pH facts: 35 parts per thousand, experience elevated ammonia levels which lowers pH levels. pH lower than 8.2 causes environmental stress and possible mortality to Phyllisoma. pH lower than 7.3 causes environmental stress and possible mortality to adults. Elevated calcium increases pH. Keep calcium levels between 380 to 450 milligrams per liter. Excessive carbon dioxide lowers pH level. Ammonia facts. Ammonia levels should be kept below 2 milligrams per liter. 2.7 to 4.4 milligrams sufficient to avoid detrimental influences on the health of Phyllisomata. 0.25 parts per million. Levels exceeding can cause mortality. Elevated ammonia can decrease pH levels. Ammonia levels should never exceed 10 milligrams per liter. Food conversion ratio, FCR. To determine the food conversion ratio, use the following formula. Weight of the feed fed to the animal divided by the weight of the animal growth. Feed conversion ratio equals weight of feed fed gram over lobster weight gain. Optimum feed conversion ratio, FCR. Minimum 12 to 1 equals 12 kilogram of high protein trash fish producing 1 gram of lobster weight. Maximum 15 to 1 equals 15 kilograms of high protein trash fish producing 1 kilogram of lobster weight, to be given at 4% of the body weight per daily ration quota. Daily ration quota to be divided into individual portions depending on feeding times. Minimum ratio, 2% of their body weight daily. Maximum growth ratio, 4% of their body weight daily. Note, do not exceed 4% feeding ratio per day. I have read of trash fish diets being fed at a FCR as high as 17 to 30 to 1. One must consider that the cost of feeding stock is 60% of the gross overhead of a lobster grow-out aquaculture facility. The key is to maximize growth rates while minimizing the feed volume needed to produce the desired end product. Uneaten food portions result in excess cost. Uneaten portions increase potential environmental waste and unwanted pollutants. Feeding times. Juveniles under 170 gram, 4 times nightly, 2 times daily, minimizes cannibalism. Subadult above 170 gram, 3 times nightly, 1 time daily. Subadult above 400 gram, 1 time nightly, 1 time daily. Adult above 800 gram, 1 time nightly. As a general rule, juvenile, subadults, and adult Panulirus ornatus should be fed 3 to 4 times a day at a minimum daily feeding ratio of 2% of their body weight per day. To maximize their growth, use a feeding ratio of 4% of their body weight per day, but do not exceed this 4% feeding ratio per day. Excessive feeding will cause excessive weight gain and excessive amounts of fat. This is bad because the lobsters will swell too large within their exoskeleton between the intermoult periods. This weight-fat swelling prevents them from being able to safely molt properly, causing molt death syndrome, MDS mortality. The inability to properly shed the old exoskeleton, combined with the new soft shell, always leaves them vulnerable to injury and cannibalism from other lobsters within the net or cage enclosure. Overfeeding also increases the chance of uneaten portions, which can lead to spoilage, which putrefies. Studies found that juveniles, when consuming putrefied portions, have a higher percentage of juvenile mortality during molting. Other juveniles, after completing their molting, were deformed and died shortly after the molt. When examined, these juveniles had calcium deposits embedded on or in the inner surface of their exoskeleton. This was contributed to a 7.5% loss of soy lecithin, and when they increased the soy lecithin to 7.5% of the dry weight of the diet, they encountered a significant decreased mortality rate. The average weight gain growth of juveniles to subadults in their first 9 months in grow-out nets and cages is 36 to 81 grams per individual per month. This is dependent on the diet they received and stage of development of the individuals. Growth rate averages: developmental stage, growth rate monthly, growth rate weekly, growth rate daily. Pueruli, 3.7 millimeter cl, 0.88 millimeter cl, 0.22 millimeter cl. Juvenile, 6 millimeter cl, 1.4 milliliter cl, 0.2 millimeter cl. Subadult, diet dependent, diet dependent, diet dependent. Adult, diet dependent, diet dependent, diet dependent. Weight gain averages: developmental stage, weight gain monthly, weight gain weekly, weight gain daily. Puerulus, 3.2 grams, 0.76 grams, 0.11 grams. Juvenile, 36 to 81 grams, 7.9 to 9.2 grams, 0.7% to 1.4% TW. Subadult, 45.8 grams, 10.9 grams, 1.5 grams. Adult, 45.8 grams, 10.9 grams, 1.5 grams. Trash fish diet. Common trash fish often mentioned in text when referring to diet for grow-out operations feeding other stock. This is a generalized term, often misinterpreted or misunderstood. This unfortunately has misleading growers to feed their stock a high fish diet. Biologically, the Panulirus ornatus are omnivores with a reasonable low protein requirement. Total trash fish diets are actually poor on nutrients and will actually slow their development times, hinder quality weight gain, and will cause pale pigmentation of the grown-out lobster's exoskeleton. They actually require an equal portion of mollusks and crustaceans supplementing their diet to help provide higher nutrient content. The real composition of so-called trash fish is typically 2% squid, 16% low-grade fish, 20.18% crabs, and 30% mussels. Diets solely consisting on strict low-grade fish need to know the effects of low lecithin levels on developing juveniles and subadults. What exactly is lecithin, you ask? Lecithin is egg yolk, which in the wild would be common source of nutrient when eating crustaceans, mussels, and fish. It is prudent to also provide a diverse nutrient diet, including crustaceans and mussels. This will help ensure a higher level of lecithin is being ingested by the developing juveniles and subadults. A feeding regimen which has diets of inadequate nutritional value can actually contribute greatly to molt death syndrome, MDS, especially in early developing stages of juveniles and subadults. When one calculates how much food a grower will need to provide his stock to raise a Panulirus ornatus to a market weight of 1/2 kilogram, just remember that the feed conversion ratio is 25 to 50 to 1. This conversion ratio is dependent on the protein content level of the food. This simply means that for every gram of weight gain requires 25 to 50 grams of food. If you are raising 100 Pueruli to a desired 500 gram, 1/2 kilogram weight, you are looking a minimum of 1,250 to 2,500 kilograms of food required to obtain your goal. This, folks, is a lot of trash fish, crustaceans, and mussels. The food provided also needs to have a sufficient protein content, but also important is high in nutrients. This is because a diet which has inadequate nutritional value can actually contribute to molt death syndrome, MDS, especially in early developmental stages of juveniles and subadults. One issue which is rarely written about but needs to be discussed, and something every lobster grower must know. Nets used for Pueruli is relatively fine mesh netting and cages. A significant proportion of uneaten food and feces remains in the bottom of nets and cages. This is because this bio-waste is unable to fall through the mesh, which is not conducive to good hygiene, general health of stock, and can hinder growth of stock due to environmental stresses of spoilage and harmful bacterial or algae blooms. Of course, one can simply replace the fine mesh netting with netting which has larger spacing openings. But this can make it far more difficult for the young lobsters to move about their nets and cages, causing their legs to often fall through the netting, causing possible injury due to entanglements or attacks from opportunistic predatory fish under the nets and cages. The larger spaced nets can also enhance stress levels, which is known to diminish the immune system of stock. Now, enclosures which have a solid seabed floor, larger spaced net flooring are not an option, and this bio-waste will simply compound daily. This is a ticking time bomb for disease outbreaks to happen. These enclosures of floating nets in more shallow waters have the similar issue, as bio-waste would simply continue to collect on the seafloor under their nets, and harmful bacterial or algae outbreaks are still possible. There are 4 primary components of waste originating from foods, which can negatively affect your stock and facility. 1. Uneaten food, generally due to bad husbandry, fish sickness, tainted or diseased, or unsuitable environmental conditions. 2. Undigested food you're raising, bivalves, clams, oysters, mussels, scallops, etc., in or around your net or enclosure. Many species of bivalves do not have sufficient control of intake and repletion. So it is easy for these bivalves to simply ingest more than they can digest. So they release an intact microalgae feces in the form of feces called pseudofeces. 3. Indigestible compounds. These are complex molecules within the foods which either are unable to be properly absorbed by the intestine due to the shape or size and or therefore rejected and released into the marine environment as particulate matter feces. 4. Excreta, which is an excrement caused when molecules enter the body and become dissolved in the plasma and then are released after being processed and degraded. These soluble compounds are then discharged back into the water through particular organs such as green glands and gills inside their enclosure. This can be a significant issue in enclosures that maintain high stocking densities, or enclosures that are spaced too closely. For every kilogram a Panulirus ornatus produces in grow-out aquaculture, there will be a minimum discharge of 15 kilograms of solid waste inside or under your nets and cages. A 3 mm by 3 mm by 3 mm enclosure produces an average of 50 kilograms of marketable stock while producing 750 kilograms of waste. This means that if you do not regularly clean your nets by flushing or siphon the bottoms of your nets or cages, you are facing possible unwanted environmental issues which can adversely affect the general health and general well-being of your stock. If your option to this solution is to use pressurized water to pressure wash your nets and cages, it is advisable to maintain one net or cage to use for the relocation of stock being held in the net or cages you want to maintain. This solution is really only advisable for larger nets and cages located in deeper water. This can be done by using a marine-rated submersible pump attached to a length of hose. This can be used to flush a net or cage clean, but this merely moves this solid waste from inside the enclosure and allowing it to settle outside of the enclosure. If seaweeds are planted heavily around your nets and cages, then the natural grasses, small fish, and small shell critters can easily consume this solid waste. Those whose nets and cages are in more shallow water locations with a minimum water flow, then this power washing option simply allows the waste to be settled outside the enclosure. But this does not prevent contaminants or particulates to be carried back into the enclosure by high tide and low tide water movement. This waste will simply continue to collect production crop after production crop. And once again, you are facing a proverbial time bomb of a potential devastating environmental outbreak. I personally prefer to use a siphoning method using a small generator and a marine-rated water pump that has both an input and output port. This input port is connected to a water hose which has an old vacuum cleaner head attached, which allows a net attendant to gently siphon the cage bottoms. The output port is connected to a water hose which connects directly to a sand filter which collects uneaten food portions, feces, and heavy particulates. The sand filter is simply a 5-gallon bucket or series of buckets using layers of coral chips, fine pea gravel, and layers of coconut or abaca fibers, and a final heavy layer of sponges. This 5-gallon sand filter can adequately filter the wastewater before allowing it to re-enter the water environment through an output hose. The sand filter can later be easily disassembled, cleaned, sterilized, and reassembled, and the collected solids and waste can then be dried, bagged, and transported to the farm to be used as soil amendments in gardens and grow beds. This is a more environmentally sound solution and helps to eliminate any potential ill effects which could be caused by excessive buildups of putrefied solid waste particulates and potential contaminants. This siphon method can be easily done every 2 days to ensure a more sterile environment for your stock without having to relocate your stock. This is particularly useful if you are stocking at high density. The siphon method also prevents the unnecessary stirring up of muds and silts, as would be done trying to clean the bottom of your nets and cages with pressurized water. This siphon method can be done in net enclosures that have a natural sea bottom, providing it is gravel and crushed coral and not sand. Sand bottom enclosures are more troublesome, as a 1 to 2 inch top layer would need to be removed weekly and replaced with clean sand top dressing. It is best to simply layer a 2 or 3 inch cobble or crushed coral layer on the sea bottom enclosure. This would allow you to easily power wash or siphon the floor of your net enclosures. Solid waste is not the only problem, as there are also the waste nitrogen in from using a fresh fish diet. I have seen it written that there is over 400 grams of waste nitrogen for every kilogram of lobster produced. One study done in 2010 on 1,600 cages in Vietnam showed the discharge of 223 tons of nitrogen and 3,350 tons of phosphorus, and that Vietnam's aquacultural industry consumes 177,000 to 364,000 tons of trash fish. You do not want or need a condition which could cause an unnecessary algae bloom, which could lead to a disease outbreak within your nets. Buyers will not purchase disease stock or unhealthy stock, so you will have to spend additional time isolating and nurturing infested stock, costing profits, or having to destroy your stock, clean your area anyways, and completely replace your nets and start all over. Being lazy, half-ass, or cutting corners can quickly become an expensive lesson on what not to do. As they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and cleanliness is next to godliness. Diet. The Panulirus ornatus will leave their dens and sheltering just prior to dusk and begin to forage for food sources. They move out into the seagrass beds, walking an average pace of 1 meter a minute while foraging. They are not limited to what is closely available, as they have been observed making long straight beelines to a feeding spot, or walking a steady, methodical, circular outward pattern, which can cover hundreds of square meters. They then return to their dens and sheltering as the dawn light levels begin to increase. This natural nocturnal foraging cue can be utilized to minimize cannibalism within the juvenile enclosures. Rather than feed them twice during the day when they would not be naturally foraging, these juvenile Panulirus ornatus should be fed smaller portions, equated not to exceed 4% of their total body weight, 5 to 6 times nightly. This time-synchronized introduction of fresh food during their natural internal nocturnal time clock should cue natural active foraging and satisfy their appetites. Then just before dusk sunlight, the sixth and final feeding be administered. Then the dusk light cues these foraging juveniles to return to their shelters. This natural rhythm minimizes their natural predatory nature, making them less likely to single out post-molt individuals who are vulnerable to attacks. Captured wild lobsters have had their foreguts examined as to content and were found to contain 65 to 85% mollusks and crustaceans, 5% echinoderms, 3.5% algae, and the remaining 10 to 25% being classified as other. This other most likely being an assortment of urchin, starfish, sea cucumbers, dung soy, fish flesh, sea worms, sea grasses, etc. The Panulirus ornatus are opportunist feeders, which tend to primarily eat live catch prey rather than feeding on carcasses. Note: inadequate nutrition contributes to molt death syndrome, MDS. In closing, I'm going to include this short video clip. It shows a small group of Panulirus ornatus in the tank we use when we randomly select some of the individuals to be inspected, measured, and weighed. These individuals were properly fed a rich, diverse nutrient diet and housed in a low-stress environment. This results in a quality premium grade end product with rich coloration to their exoskeleton and excellent shell luster, capable of yielding a premium price. This video is shot under shaded, natural sunlight conditions, free of artificial lighting, lens filters, or video manipulation, so viewers can view and gauge as an example for their own production quality. This video was taken with an inexpensive Sportscam 1080p Pro 30 and a clear, waterproof encasement. This is what I use to shoot all of my underwater clips and photos.